They told me revenge would feel hollow. They said it would be quieter than I imagined. An empty room, a colder victory. I was tired of hearing what other people believed about the shape of grief, so I decided to learn by doing. My name is Alexandra. I remember the day everything changed as if it were a photograph left too long in the sun. Harsh edges, colors burned into skin. Daniel and I had an apartment that smelled of citrus and old books, on the 4th floor of a building that leaned like a secret toward the river. He was handsome in that comfortable, effortless way that makes people stop and tilt a head. Not because they wanted to see more of him, but because they wanted to catalog him into something easy to name. He worked in a small architecture firm, sketched late into the night, and loved to make lists. I loved him the way some people love weather. Because it was constant and rarely surprising. We had been a pair for 3 years, with the long pause of a pandemic contracted into them. Boredom, crossword puzzles, the peculiar intimacy of being the only person in your life who could reach for the last piece of chocolate. I had believed in us the way a leaf believes in sunlight. Then there was a photograph. Daniel in a coffee shop, his arm around another woman, smiling in a way I recognized and had belonged to me. I found it by accident, as many betrayals appear, found not in the spotlight of confrontation but in the careless gutter of daily life. I was looking through his phone for his banking app because he'd left it open and I needed a quick receipt. The photo was nestled in a folder labeled, Work, Pass. It should have been a benign tag. It was not. The woman's laugh was a live wire. The way she angled toward him was private, not performative. There was lipstick on her cheek. Daniel's cheek. The timestamp said 2 nights ago. I did not scream. I did not throw things. I folded the phone back into its case and breathed like an animal that had smelled smoke in a house it had thought safe. Something in me did not collapse. It ignited. There is an animal cunning to grief that people seldom mention, the taste of something hot and urgent on the tongue. Anger came, but it was not my only response. Something colder, clearer, began to settle. Why didn't you tell me? I asked that night, when Daniel came home late, under a sky low with rain. He blinked, surprised to be asked. He always looked surprised when confronted with things that required emotional labor. Tell you what? Our photos, I said. Her name. That there is a photograph of you with another woman. He went pale, then defensive, then apologetic in patterns I recognized. Alex, it's nothing work, you know. We were at a conference. It was a stupid photo. I didn't think. You didn't think to tell me, I interrupted. He reached for my hand and I let him, like a landmine covered with a blanket. I felt the skin of his palm and catalogued the temperature, the roughness, the certainty with which he assumed the world would settle itself back into the old grooves. I could have forgiven him then in a breath. I could have shuffled us deeper into the same groove. But something in me, the part that writes and measures and understands patterns, realized this betrayal was a hinge. If I forgave him with a shrug, that hinge would be invisible and the door would stay shut. I wanted the door open. I wanted him to stand on the other side and see what his choice had unlocked. The first weeks after discovery were a study in patience. I did the thing lovers often don't do when betrayed. I watched without making a spectacle. I watched his routines. I learned his rhythms and stitched them together like a map. I learned the coffee shops he preferred, the clients he took to dinners, the way his phone vibrated with messages at 4 in the afternoon if he had forgotten logistics. I read receipts. I noticed who liked his social media posts and when. I created a ledger in my head and in a worn leather notebook I kept hidden in the kitchen drawer. Dates, places, names, small facts that looked harmless until arranged together. Maya, his colleague, appeared on page 3 of the ledger. Short hair, a scar on the right eyebrow. He had a thing in his voice about that scar, how she'd gotten it as a child falling off a bicycle. Her name swam in the margins. Maya. I knew Maya. She had been polite to me when we'd met at a firm party with the awkward tenderness of professional people pretending to like one another. I had never imagined her as the woman in the photo, because people who are kind in small public places sometimes hide a different interior. I crafted a plan because plans are the only way to make chaos legible. Not the melodramatic, noisy revenge of television. No vandalism in broad daylight, no blood on the pavement. I had read too many thrillers as a child and learned their lesson. Violence without psychology is a blunt instrument. I wanted architecture as revenge, structure, pressure, collapse precisely positioned. First, I dismantled the lie. I sent anonymous messages to Maya's professional email. Short, what seems like helpful notes. Have you considered how your behavior looks to others? There are consequences for workplace relationships. I scattered hints, a rumor here, a misdelivered package there, the kind of small doubt that accumulates like dust. I did not accuse. I did not name Daniel. I let the suspicion spread like a stain. People under suspicion act oddly. Guilt has a geometry to it. The more you prod, the more it shows it seems. Maya started being late to work, then earlier than usual, then absent. Daniel, the steady one, grew distracted. Calls he could not explain, defensiveness thin as tissue. The architecture firm, a small organism of egos and anxieties, began to buzz. Partnerships that had been comfortable before shifted like furniture on a ship. But the ledger, the honest ledger, did not end there. I wanted public exposure because private pain shared is less isolating, and I wanted him to feel the unraveling as an audience would. I learned Daniel's weekly meeting rhythm. Tuesdays, 10 a.m. He liked to arrive early, take the window seat, sip a specific herbal tea. I created an email account, a name that looked like industry news, and I wrote a press release about professional misconduct, anonymous enough to be plausible without being traceable. I sent it to the firm's HR, to the partners, to a design blog that loved scandal more than it loved architecture. I made sure the facts were ambiguous but suggestive, like a photograph with the face behind a blur. None of this required special skills beyond patience and an eye for what people would believe. After the release, the partners called an emergency meeting. Gossip is a language most offices speak fluently. Daniel was furious, of course. He accused me of overreacting, then of being cruel, then of being a coward who sent messages behind his back. His confusion gave him a face I recognized. A man trying to reorder the world after he had become its accused. He staggered between rage and pleading, both of which I knew well enough to make a plan around. At night, after the meetings, I would sit in our living room and list his possible reactions. Would he leave? Would he fight back? Would he attempt to make a public apology? I wanted him to have options, and I wanted none of them to lead back to the security of our old life. I wanted him to walk visibly through consequences and see, in each step, the architecture of his choice. So I wove a pressure system. Maya's inbox received a single anonymous note, a photograph of Daniel, the one from the coffee shop with the caption, "You should know." It was the cruelty of withholding a full explanation. A half-truth designed to provoke confession. Maya answered in a private message that I intercepted by a small technicality. She had used the same coffee shop Wi-Fi for her tablet and a router name I had spoofed. I felt a small illicit thrill. Technology is a lever. She confessed to me in a sobbing voicemail 2 days later, not knowing it was me she had told. "I didn't mean," she said. "He said it would be casual. He said it would be nothing." Her voice was ragged. I wanted to hold the phone to my chest and press all the reasons I had for being hurt into the sound, but I did not. I took the voicemail and made of it what an investigator would. Evidence of inconsistency, a narrative stick I could prod into the firm's partners. The real victory in this early phase was not spectacle but uncertainty. Daniel's colleagues began to whisper. Clients cancelled a small project. Maya stopped coming into the studio. The blog's comments section, which had been idle for months, exploded with speculation. In the center of this, Daniel stood like an animal bewildered by its reflection. He kept searching my face for the shape of betrayal, for the list I had been keeping so carefully, and he never suspected I was the architect of his exposure. But a single campaign of pressure is not a collapse. Buildings that fall do so because their foundation is eaten away. So I turned toward the foundation. His public life, his reputation, the things he had built that were not mine. He had a mentor, Richard, a partner who had taken Daniel in when he was a junior and taught him how to measure light like a hymn. Richard had a reputation for fierce loyalty to the firm and a secret love for the young. I learned that Richard liked to host dinners on Fridays, small circles of influence. I cultivated an invitation because I knew being invited to a circle means being seen. I arrived at Richard's house wearing a dress I'd bought for a different purpose. A measure between the familiar and the performative, because appearances had power. I listened to the dinner conversation like a translator learning a new language. Jokes held up as tests, compliments as currency. After that dinner, I sent Richard an edited copy of the firm's email thread, with a small embellishment. A line that suggested Richard had known more than he'd let on. It was a literary dirty trick. One sentence inserted, the rest authentic. Within 48 hours, Richard was on edge, and loyalty curdled into self-preservation. He demanded answers from Daniel, who offered none that satisfied a man who was suddenly afraid of being dragged into scandal. What I had learned the hard way was that people who value image above truth will scatter the instant the image twitches. They are mercenaries of perception. My small, surgical nudges had become a landslide, and I watched, fascinated and cruel, as the firm's support for Daniel collapsed. He had not expected to lose allies. He had believed that his competence would be armor. He had been wrong. Once the firm began an investigation, once Richard distanced himself, Daniel's world constricted. He called me at odd hours, midnight, the brittle hour where anything seems possible, and begged me to help. He offered to fix things. He promised to leave with his dignity intact. Dignity? I asked once, when the rain stitched itself against the window. You left me. Is that dignity? He learned, painfully, how to be small. The process of being accused is a corrosive thing that sharpens some people and shatters others. Daniel shattered. He began to attend therapy. The firm reassigned him. He moved his things into a small storage unit that smelled of metal and damp cardboard. The sight of his empty desk felt like a stage that had been cleared while an audience still waited outside. But I could not stop there. There is a part of revenge that craves narrative. A beginning, a midpoint, a public reckoning. I wanted him to stand and see himself in all the reflections he had helped create. So I engineered a finale that played upon his vanity. He had a mid-career showcase scheduled at a gallery downtown, an evening where his models and mentors would attend, where he would speak about light and restraint like a small priest offering terms for truth. I waited until 3 nights before the show and mailed an anonymous invitation to each of his former clients, to the partners, to a few influential critics I had found through research. I titled the invitation For Drama, On the Ethics of Desire, and wrote nothing else. People like mysteries. They desire to be front-row witnesses. On the night, the gallery was full of warm lights and the scent of white wine. Daniel, dressed in his safe black suit, looked like a man about to preach, and he tried to smile. I watched from the back, in a coat he did not know I owned, because to be anonymous is to be both spectator and judge. The evening began with small praises, with polite conversations about method. Then a critic I had gently prodded from an art magazine stood and spoke. He did not accuse Daniel by name. He did not need to. He read aloud the email thread I had edited earlier, the one with Richard's name, suddenly, publicly. He read the lines as if reciting a poem about moral failure in the studio. The room fell into a particular hush, the kind that eats sound. Daniel's face changed. He laughed first, a brittle sound, then grew angry, then collapsed inward. He tried, halfway through, to call me out, to demand who had set the works there. He did not know that the critic had been guided by a sample of my handwriting, a note that suggested further conversation, left at a cafe where Daniel often sketched. It was like pulling a thread on a sweater. The whole garment unpeeled. The gallery's director told him the exhibition would be postponed until some questions were answered. Clients murmured. Cameras flashed. I watched the man who had once been a center of gravity in my life orbit emptily, like a satellite the pull of which had been switched off. After the show, Daniel came home. He found a note on the kitchen table, folded twice, as if waiting for him in a domestic display of finality. He opened it with hands that trembled not with fear of my judgment but with fatigue. I wanted you to see, the note read. Not just discover, not just hear things from strangers. You deserve to see the architecture of your choices. You deserve to feel your life become the construction you made for someone else. He looked around at the apartment, the photographs of us, the playlist that still had my laugh in the margins. He read the note twice and then finally he began to speak. I never thought it would come to this, he said. I never thought. You never thought you'd have to look at the house you built and wonder whose name was on the foundations, I said. This was not the triumphant scream of a comic book villain. It was a modest, carefully measured end. I did not smash his phone in the sink. I did not pour salt on his pillow. I left him with enough to live on, because I had never wanted his ruin in the way men imagine. Pain that breaks someone entirely. I wanted consequence. I wanted a mirror. He left 2 weeks later. I watched him pack, slow, methodical, like someone trying to keep a memory intact by parceling it into labeled boxes. He hugged me once at the door, a gesture that tried to make what had gone wrong into a private sorrow we could still share. I let him go. In the months that followed, There was a curious hollow in me that I had not anticipated. The revenge had been precise. The firm moved on. Maya left for another city, and rumor said she had enrolled in a design school and found herself. Daniel taught occasionally at a university, hands humming with the ghost of craft. The city was indifferent, and that indifference, oddly, felt like mercy. People asked me later if I felt lighter afterward, if the weight had lifted. I told them the truth. Some weights change shape. Grief, when folded into action, becomes something else. It can harden into a border, keep future storms off your lawn. But it also changes the soil beneath you. I had learned how to aim my intelligence like a blade. I had learned the geometry of people's reputations, the brittle threads that hold them up. I had practiced a kind of cruelty and discovered that it carried scars. The most unexpected victory came quietly. One afternoon, some months after everyone had gone on to their lives, I received a letter in the post. Daniel had written it, not to beg, not to plead, but to explain in a way that felt like apology and confession folded together. "I did not mean to hurt you," he wrote. "But I did. I was trying to feel something new, and in the process I broke a life that belonged to both of us. You taught me how to look at the world and measure light, but you also taught me how to notice the wrongness of the way I moved through other people's hearts. I cannot ask for forgiveness. I can only say I see now." There was a humility to the letter that was its own small weight. I read it 3 times. I placed it in a drawer with the ledger, my old notebook, and closed it. If revenge is a play, then its final act is always the audience leaving. I watched the people who had been my audience, colleagues, the critic, a mutual friend named Tomas who had watched the collapse from the sidelines, go about their lives, and I felt the sensation of an experiment concluded. The knowledge that I could rearrange the scaffolding of someone's life had a heady effect, but the more profound knowledge was of my own capacity to endure the consequences of deliberate action. That endurance felt like a muscle. There was a moment later, standing on the bridge where the city's lights reflected like ink in water, that I realized the shape this had taken. Revenge had not been about making him as miserable as I was. It had been about demonstrating to myself that I could be as decisive as I needed to be. It had been a lesson in agency. I had been pushed into one of 2 choices: accept the lie and stay, or dismantle the life built on deception. I had chosen to dismantle because I valued the integrity of my future more than the fraught comfort of the past. People often imagine revenge as a firewalk. Pain for pain. My revenge was quieter, an engineering problem. Remove the keystone and let the arch fall. It taught me another lesson: how fragile reputation is, how quickly the scaffolding can be removed from under a person who had believed in his own solidity. There were costs. I lost friends who could not abide my methods. Some called me cruel. Others called me brilliant. Labels have a way of being both absolving and binding. What I do know is this: I learned to stand in my own truth without flinching. I built a new set of boundaries that were not walls but doors I could open and close. Months later, on an ordinary Tuesday, I found myself across a small table from a man named Adam, an editor who loved language the way I loved lines and edges. He asked me about my life, and I, for once, spoke without measuring because the heavy ledger of proof I had kept was no longer necessary. I had been made into a different person by the architecture of my choices. I spoke of betrayal not as an abstract thing but as a teacher that had given me unexpected curriculum. Patience, planning, the art of consequence. "You sound whole," he said at one point, tentatively, as if testing a bridge. I smiled, because everything became more bearable when someone else could see the edges and still choose to stand close. "I am not whole," I said. "I'm repaired in parts." There is a dangerous vanity to believing you can control everything. I never believed that, only that some things deserve being understood, and that sommity. The only way to understand a betrayal is to dismantle the structure that allowed it. At night, sometimes, I still wake with the neat vibration of the old ledger in my chest. I remember the smell of Maya's voice on that intercepted voicemail, the way the critic read aloud at the gallery like a small execution, the way Daniel packed boxes labeled in his own handwriting. Sometimes I feel the urge to orchestrate more reveals, to test the world again. But the world doesn't need my experiments. It provides its own heat. I keep my notebook still, but I no longer add pages for the purpose of war. I write now for other purposes. Lists of small pleasures, recipes, a plan to learn a new language. I have learned that victory is not a bell you ring. It is a quieter thing. The steady breath after a storm, the decision to plant something where rubble once lay. I planted a small fig tree on my balcony the spring after. It began to bear fruit. I have eaten the figs and I have been surprised at how sweet they are. Revenge taught me to be precise, to anticipate, to hurt only as much as necessary. It taught me that sometimes the most powerful act is withdrawal, removing the central plank and letting consequence do the rest. It taught me that victory is not necessarily about annihilation but about remaking the terms of your life so that those who wronged you cannot easily step back into it. If you ask me now whether I feel triumphant, I would say yes, but in a way that is tempered by fatigue and the soft knowledge that nothing is entirely won. We are always drafting new architectures for ourselves, relationships, careers, loyalties, and someday I may be the one built on a fault line. For now, though, I have an apartment that smells of citrus and old books, a fig tree at the window, and a life that is mine to measure again. My name is Alexandra. I learned how to take a life apart and put it back together with different pieces. I learned that when someone else chooses to make a home of your trust, you have the right to decide whether you will live in that home or dismantle it. I chose to dismantle, to build something that would bear my own name. They said the story would end when the last box was carried out the door and the apartment settled back into itself. They meant the visible parts, the empty drawers, the echo in the hallway. They forgot about what lives in the margins. The ledger, the small craft of habit that can become a map for someone else. A few months after Daniel left and the fig tree put out its first stubborn leaves, something changed in the air. It began with a package, no return address, a plain brown envelope with my name written in a hand I did not recognize. Inside, on the top, lay a photograph, not the coffee shop one this time, but a snapshot of my ledger, a corner of the worn leather cover visible, the top page open to a list. Someone had taken that photo with a casual cruelty. Beneath it, a single line in black ink, "You cut too sharp." I held the photo until my fingers ached. It should have been a simple threat, and it was, thin and brittle. But threats are a kind of conversation, and I had learned to listen. Whoever had sent it knew about the ledger. Whoever knew about the ledger shook the scaffolding of my victory with the same soft fingers I had used to pull it down. I imagined Tomas, the mutual friend who had watched things once and refused to get involved. I imagined Maya, now in another city, perhaps building something from the ruins. I imagined Daniel, who had learned to measure light but maybe not shadow. I imagined a stranger. Threats are often most effective when they ask you to imagine the faces you cannot place. I did what I had always done. I catalogued. Date: Thursday. Location: left on the kitchen table. Possible motive: revenge. Warning: power play. The ledger had been hidden, the pages folded under a false bottom I had installed in a drawer. Whoever had taken the picture had found the ledger and photographed it with the confidence of someone who understood that exposure could be a weapon. So the second phase did not begin with a dramatic reveal. It began with a choice: escalate, return fire with the architecture I had perfected, or step away. The reasonable part of me, the part that had learned how to build things that lasted, advised stepping away. Revenge had been an effective teacher, but it had also taught me how to take apart lives. There is a cost to that skill. I had not yet paid it. I called Adam, the editor who had become a small, patient anchor, and told him in fragments what had happened. We spoke in a voice that kept to ordinary things at first, weather, figs, and then, as if with a shared permission, we let the edges come. "Don't make it into a contest," he said simply. "If you answer, you perpetuate. If you don't, you might still be scared, but you won't be feeding the apparatus." Advice sounds easy when someone else gives it. Putting it into practice was harder. My hands wanted to reach for the ledger, to learn whose fingerprints I could turn back on. My mind conducted small, precise experiments. Who would profit from stirring up the firm again? Who might want Daniel back in the public light? But each experiment ended in the same place. Consequence on a scale I had not intended. The anonymous photograph was followed by more letters, a pattern of small escalations that read like a child testing a boundary. A voicemail left on my phone with breathing for 2 minutes. A message delivered to the gallery's director, hinting that the critic's piece had been planted. The net was being shaken, and I was inside it. One night I sat on the edge of the bed with the ledger on my knees and thought of the fig tree outside the window. It had been fragile the first spring, then stubborn. I realized my own stubbornness had been a kind of overwatering. Too much attention, too many interventions. I was learning through uneasy repetitions that power is like salt: a little preserves, too much ruins. So I made a different plan, not to fight back, but to neutralize the weapon. I photographed the ledger from my own hands and made a copy. Not an original with intimate marginalia, but a redacted version that told a smaller truth. I wrote a letter of my own, not a defense, not an accusation, just a statement of what had happened from my point of view. I signed it. I addressed it to the people who had been most harmed by the cascade. Maya, Richard, the gallery director, Tomas. This was not a public performance. The envelopes were personal. I wrote in a way that asked for nothing but recognition. An acknowledgement that choices had been made and they had consequences. I did not apologize for the existence of my ledger, because it had existed as an instrument of clarity. I apologized for the harm it had caused in being exposed. My voice in those letters was small and direct. I mailed them and waited, which is a kind of work I had seldom practiced. Waiting taught me things. The human capacity to be incredulous, to need time to rearrange the furniture of belief. Some letters were answered with silence. Some with cold formalities. Maya, whose handwriting I recognized as a little slanted and nervous, wrote back in a single page that read like an experiment in grace. She said she had been ashamed, then brave, then ashamed again, and that moving had taught her how to be less defined by what others saw. She wrote that she did not want to be part of any continuing spectacle. I wrote back and asked nothing but told everything. A week after the letters, the anonymous packages stopped. The breathing voicemail did not recur. The critic contacted the gallery and quietly retracted his implications. Life reassembled itself like a room someone had cleaned, not as pristine as before, but usable. But the second phase of my life was not only about outside threats. The cost I had not accounted for sat inside me. The knowledge that I could dismantle, and the temptation to do so again. Victories can become their own hunger if you do not learn to feed something else. I found myself waking at odd hours with plans I had never followed through. Small tests of control. I realized the ledger had been more than a list. It had been a scaffold for my sense of consequence. Remove it and something in me trembled. So I took another step that felt as brave as anything I had ever done. I began therapy. It was a small, dispassionate office on the third floor of a building that smelled of lemon cleaner and old magazines. My therapist, Mara, asked questions like someone cataloging a specimen. "What did the ledger give you besides information?" she asked on the second session. "Boundaries," I said at once. "And what happens when those boundaries are enforced by other people?" she asked. "That they break," I said. "And who are you if the ledger is not a tool you wield?" she asked lastly, with the soft curiosity of a person who believes change is possible. That question felt like a complicated object dropped into my hands. I did not have a graceful answer. I had enough sense to know the honest ones were not eloquent. I said instead slowly, "I am learning." One afternoon, the day the fig tree dropped 2 green fruit onto the balcony floor like small clumsy gifts, I received a visitor. Maya stood in the doorway of my apartment with a suitcase beside her, and a look that was not triumph or guilt but an odd hybrid. Cautious peace. We had not planned this meeting. She said she had come back to the city to finish a course and to understand her past choices without the noise. We sat at the small kitchen table, the same one where Daniel had once spilled herbal tea, and we talked. Not in the performative way of courtroom confessions, but like two people cataloging what had happened and what they had learned. She told me about the design classes, about how rebuilding her sense of craft had become her own kind of therapy. I told her, without the ledger, without the list, about the choices I had made that winter. There was an awkwardness between us that did not evaporate. It settled into place like furniture that now had to be lived with. We did not hug. We did not forgive each other wholesale. We acknowledged that harm had been done and that we both bore parts of it. "You taught me about consequences," she said finally, more to herself than to me. "I'm trying to learn how to be one who can bear them." In that moment I felt something I had thought I had dismantled. A tender human thing, the possibility of repair. It was not romantic. It did not deny the damage. It simply acknowledged that we were each trying to live through the outcomes of our choices. The last act of the new phase was quieter than I imagined. One morning I walked to the place where the river cut through the city and sat on the ledge where I used to sketch the skyline. The city moved around me with indifferent fluency. A child on a scooter almost collided with a dog that barked a punctuation point at time. Everything kept going. I took the ledger from the small safe where I kept it and opened to the first page. The lists were honest and ugly in places. I read the names and dates and realized I did not need the ledger to remember what had happened. Memory is a more reliable archive than any leather-bound book, because it lives inside people and changes with their own growth. I did not burn the ledger or make a show of its destruction. I folded it closed and placed it back in the drawer, beneath grocery lists and recipes. Some instruments deserve to be retired, not demolished. The fig tree on my balcony had begun to bear a small, stubborn crop. I clipped a ripe fruit, cut it in two, and ate it until the sweet stickiness was on my fingertips. It tasted like something I had not tasted when I was younger. The particular flavor of a small, hard-won piece. When people ask me if I regret the way I acted, I answer honestly. There are many things I would do differently now. I would have told Daniel sooner and more clearly that our house had cracked. I would have spoken with Maya differently, in a way that held space for her complex needs. I would have sought help for the wound instead of building with it. But I do not regret that I reclaimed my life. Agency has a cost, and I paid it. The lesson I keep is not a recipe for revenge but a plea for deliberation. The story ends, if it can be said to end, with me opening a small notebook and writing a new kind of list. Recipes I want to try, things I want to read, languages I will attempt, people I will invite into my life with care. There is a sensible rhythm to it. Pleasure balanced by attention, choice framed by consequence. I have not forgiven everyone. I have not erased the past. But I have learned to make a different architecture for my future, one where I do not sharpen my mind into a weapon and hand it to myself as a remedy. I plant the fig tree each spring with the same ritual. A small promise that some things can be nurtured rather than engineered. My name is Alexandra. I chose a path that taught me how to wield consequence. Then I chose another path. Harder, quieter. Where I learned to live with the consequences I had helped create. The final victory was not over them. It was a victory of restraint over demonstration, of repair over spectacle, and of choosing a life that could be measured again by small, sensible things. Figs, friendship, the slow stitch of therapy, the honest inbox of letters returned with signatures.